Hello, everyone. Welcome to part two of this 80s conversation. This is going to be broken up into 6 parts. Part one is the first half of the decade, 80 through 84. Part two is going to be 85 through 89. Part three is going to be a focus more on the Rams and their decade and kind of how it really made them what they were heading into the 90s, which was one of the favored teams to win a Super Bowl. And then, I'm also going to then talk about some of the great games and just some of the elements that made the 80s great, like their players and things like that. So you're going to look forward to this whole series that I'm putting together. Now, I want to, wrap up with what we talked about last go-round. We talked about how the Vikings, the Rams, the Cowboys, the Steelers, and the Raiders were kind of the elite teams of the 70s, and you could kind of throw Miami in there for half of the decade. The first half of the decade, they were great, and then fell off the second half of the decade. By the 1980s, by this point in 1980, going into 85, the Raiders were still thought to be one of the elite teams and weren't going to go anywhere for a long, long time. The 49ers had replaced, for all intents and purposes, the Los Angeles Rams or the Minnesota Vikings, take your pick, as one of the elite teams. Dallas kind of kept its status, right? The Steelers they're kind of dying out. And people are looking at Miami as the replacement for Pittsburgh. Even though Pittsburgh made the playoffs 3 times in the first half of the decade, they only went beyond the first round once in that entire timetable. So there was a lot of people going, yeah, but they got beat by San Diego and Pittsburgh. They got blown out by the Raiders in Oakland or LA. And in the AFC playoffs in 84, they squeaked, and granted, it was a big win. They squeaked by Denver, but then got blown out by Miami. And by 85, with the season the Steelers would have, they're pretty much out of the equation. So people are kind of starting to look, who's going to be the elite team here? So, the Cowboys have stayed put. The Bears have replaced the Rams pretty much. The 49ers have pretty much replaced the Vikings in the NFC. But the Rams are still relevant. So they're creating a fourth team that's getting a lot of buzz. You got to understand, after the Rams got Eric Dickerson, everyone knew this team was a quarterback away from being a dominant team in the league. So after 83's 1,800-yard season and 84's 2,100-yard season, and Eric Dickerson holding out in 85 and the Rams still going 3-0, people were on high alert that, okay, the Rams are a really good football team and they're made with defense, so they're always going to be competitive in this new era of football. So instead of only having 3 elite teams in the NFC, teams are putting a fourth one in there, right? Maybe the addition of Chicago, maybe, but, the Rams certainly aren't in that same category at this point. Even going into 85, I'm too young to remember, but I've gone back and looked at a lot of the videos and a lot of the talking that went on. And the Rams were expected to be a very good team in 85 because they felt like Dieter Brock was somebody that could bring some consistency to the position, certainly more than what Jeff Kemp offered. But Eric Dickerson being healthy for, more of the season because he wasn't being used the first 3 weeks as much. But more importantly, their defense. They drafted a first-round pick out of Texas, was a defensive back by the name of Jerry Gray, who was an outstanding special teams player and will eventually become one of the Rams' greatest corners of all time. So there's an acknowledgement there that the Rams aren't getting worse. They're consistent, right? So it's, the Raiders, the Cowboys, the Rams, they're staying put, but there's some new blood coming up. So with 85, the Bears were pretty much picked by a lot of experts to make a run at the Super Bowl because of that defense. And that's another thing that I want to point out about the 80s that I love so much. Unlike today, where these people constantly, cannot acknowledge good teams coming up. I mean, I'm listening to Colin Cowherd, and I'm sorry, LT, I know you like Colin Cowherd, but I think that guy is the biggest farce and joke of a broadcaster and a sports analyst person I think I've heard in a long, long time. And this guy's sitting here refusing to acknowledge the Cleveland Browns' growth, saying, until they win more than 8 games, I don't want to hear about the Cleveland Browns. And I think it's funny because you didn't hear that in the 80s. people would look at the roster and they go, this team improved. They looked at the Chicago Bears and they went, this defense has got a year under its belt. They've gotten, this Wilbur Marshall kid is pretty good. This Otis Wilson is a beast. We know how great Singletary is. They've got 2 lockdown corners. They've got an unbelievable safety. Their quarterback has played really well the last few years. The running back is a Hall of Famer. And their offensive line that they drafted in 83 looks like an all-pro offensive lineman by the end of looks like an all-pro offensive line by the end of 84. It wasn't hard for them to go, Bears win the Super Bowl. You couldn't get that today. Do you know how many people are still picking New England against New Orleans? It's pathetic. Nobody is giving anybody outside of the Patriots a chance to win the Super Bowl this year, except for maybe Kansas City. And I don't even know that Kansas City is going to be as good. They've lost a lot of talent. And the Browns have gained a lot more talent. I actually am going to go on a limb and say I think on paper the Browns are a better football team. That doesn't mean the results are going to pan that out, but you've got to look at what the teams are taking the field with and go talent versus talent. Where do they stand? So a lot of the experts in 85, they got it right. They said Pittsburgh wasn't going to be as good as they were in 84 and would be lucky to win the division. They didn't. They said that the Bengals had real problems to overcome if they wanted to retake the division, and they just didn't feel like they had taken that over. Everyone kind of said the Browns are going to win the AFC Central if they stay healthy and if they play well. That was the sentiment in 85, right? The Bears were picked to win the North. Now the Dolphins were still highly popular and were picked to win the East. But a lot of people widely said the following statement. In 84, 85, 86, 87 even. They said, on paper, the most talented team in the National Football League, player for player, roster spot for roster spot, is the New England Patriots. They got the best wide receiving core. They got one of the best offensive lines. They've got one of the best linebacking cores. At the time, they said they had the best linebacking core, and that's because Carl Banks and Lawrence Taylor hadn't really proven what they had until this particular season, 85. But everyone acknowledged that the Patriots were really a good football team. With the Jets, they kind of surprised people because Freddie McNeil was such a good rookie in 83, but had, even though he was good in 84, Ken O'Brien looked really good, but the Jets just didn't have a lot left on defense. And people were like, well, the Jets, they got to compete against those 2 teams in the East. I don't know. And obviously the Raiders were still picked to win the West, although Denver actually in 85 was picked to win the West, and the Raiders were picked to be a wild card team. Fun fact. In the East, people were saying it's going to be Washington or Dallas, right? And people picked the 49ers to win the West. But as the season broke down, what I liked about it, and I have every game, week 1 through 16, not every single game, but I have every week, I have at least one game or more from the 85 season. And the thing that I really love about watching it is how the announcers are talking about teams, even the Buccaneers, who were abysmal that year. I think they went 4-12, 5-11. They talked about the Buccaneers, James Wallander, how great of a player he was. They talked about how good Steve Young could be, and this upcoming quarterback that could be, the answer to the Tampa Bay Buccaneer problems. Of course, they talked about the Rams being 7-0 to start the year and how that whole thing transpired. But as the 85 season unfolded, the Bears get off to a 13-0 start. Their only loss is a Monday night game to Chicago. Many Bear fans think that game was rigged. I don't know. I'm not going to go that far. I just think that the Bears really didn't have an answer for the short passing game that the Dolphins came into the game with. And it's a good thing that they did that because it made the Bears prepare for other things offensively or defensively than what they had seen all year long. But what's interesting about the Bears, and I want to mention here, is Chicago gave up 28, 24, and 19 points in the first 5 weeks of the season. From week 6 through the postseason, the Chicago Bears will only give up 17 points or more twice the rest of the season. Okay? So that's 11 regular season games and 3 playoff games. In 14 games, you want to know how great that Bear defense was? They didn't give up 13 points. Yeah, they didn't give up 13 points or more outside of those 2 games, which was against the Lions at the end of the season and against the Dolphins in their only defeat. Other than that, no one cracked beyond 10 points. Think about how dominant of a defense that is over a 14-week period. The Bears, everybody knew the Bears were going to win the Super Bowl. And I think for me, not being alive, so I can't speak to Ram fans, the Rams getting off to their 7-0 start, it wasn't smoke and mirrors, but it was done by defense. And once the defense calmed down, it was going to be harder for the Rams. And it was. The Rams would end up going 6-5 down the stretch. I'm sorry. They would end up going 4-5 down the stretch. So it ended up 11-5. They really struggled when that defense cooled off. But there's no question the Rams are the number 2 seeded team in the NFC at this point. The Bears and Rams all year long were 1-2. Right from the gate, Chicago goes 13-0. The Rams go 7-0. Everyone knows, right? But with the Rams fledgling at the end of the season, people thought the Rams might have been vulnerable to defeat. In the AFC, your top 2 seeds were what they've been for a good chunk of time, right? 83, 82. These were your 1 and 2 seeds. And they were it again in 85. The Dolphins and the Raiders, both 12-4, both 1 and 2 seeds. Once again, the road's going to go through the Orange Bowl or it's going to go through the Coliseum with the Raiders. So, that wasn't necessarily unexpected. What was unexpected was Plunkett's demise entirely, and that the Raiders were relying heavily on Marcus Allen, who I believe he ended up winning the NFL MVP that year. And if it wasn't for Marcus Allen, I don't know that the Raiders win 10 games. But put all that aside, the Raiders are 12-4. They're the 2 seed, and everyone goes the best team in football in the AFC. Miami and the Raiders, it's going to be a great championship game if those 2 teams play. Now, the other division winners I'll cover, the Browns at 8-8, did win the AFC Central. And a lot of people didn't think that the Browns were particularly deserving of it because there were moments in that season where they played really, really poorly. But transitioning with a new coach, having a rookie quarterback in Bernie Kosar, having, this running game where they literally were treating Bernie Kosar like a kid. If you thought that the Rams were coddling Jared Goff, you should watch some games in 85 and see how the Browns are coddling Bernie Kosar. Now, Bernie has an advantage. He has a great defense, he has a great coach, and he has a great offensive line in front of him that's blocking like crazy for the running game, and he has 2 good backs that are going to both rush for 1,000 yards in Kevin Mack and Ernest Biner. So the Browns are set for a good future run. And 88 was kind of you better pay attention to this team because 8-8, this is going to be the least of their records for the rest of the decade. And it turned out to be the case. The Cowboys would end up winning the NFC East with an 11-5 record. And the Cowboys were a weak 11-5 in comparison to some of their teams in the past. Danny White was really having a rough year. Tony Dorsett really struggled. I mean, Tony Dorsett would rush for 1,300 yards, but he got a bulk of those yards against weaker teams. And when they played better competition, Dallas really, really did struggle. And, people are like, it's almost like the Rams took something out of them in 83 because they never recovered in 84, despite getting off to that great start. And then the roof just completely fell apart on them. That was 83. In 84, they just finished 9-7 and never really looked right. And a lot of people said in 85, Dallas didn't look right either. That there were signs that this was an aging team with a tired system that people were kind of figuring out. But Dallas made it. And they made it as division champs. And they were going to play in Anaheim against the Rams. The wild card teams were pretty solid in 85. You had the Jets at 11-5 against the Patriots at 11-5. And remember, the division winner was 12-4. The Jets, I think, were really the surprise for everybody in 85. The Jets, under Ken O'Brien and Freeman McNeil and Al Toon and Wesley Walker, who looked like a young Wesley Walker, people were like, whoa. Whoa, between the Jets defense, between the Jets special teams, watch out for New York. And the Patriots finally played up to that potential. So 85's packed with excitement, right? You've got everyone's favorite and pretty much foregone conclusion to win the Super Bowl in the Bears, right? You've got the Dolphins and the Raiders, so you've got a little bit of classic with a little bit of new, Jets and Patriots. That's not seen before, okay? And these Browns, second division title in 20 years or close to 20 years, maybe more. Here we go, or close to 10 years, maybe a little over 10 years. Here we go. The AFC, man, this thing could be really fun. In the NFC, you had the Rams that people were like, I know the Rams struggled at the end of the year, but people were like, well, maybe this Ram team's better than we thought. And then you had the Giants, you had the Cowboys, still there as usual, and you had the 49ers, who make the playoffs as a wild card team as well, because they finished, I believe, 10-6 that year. So as the playoffs break down, the 49ers go to New York, a rematch of the 84 divisional playoff game, and New York beats the living pants off of the 49ers 17-3. Roger Craig looked really bad in that game. He was fighting an injury, but the Giants defense and Mark Bavaro's on offense they dominated the day. And the Giants would prevail and beat the San Francisco 49ers and make it to the AFC or NFC divisional playoff game in Chicago. Now, the Rams would play Dallas, and the Rams obliterated Dallas. It was 3-0 at halftime. It was 20-3 or 20-0 by the end of the game. And if there was any doubt that the Cowboys dynasty is going to be wiped off the face of the planet after this game, you were either delusional, a Cowboy fan, or you just couldn't read the tea leaves, because Dallas will come out strong in 86, but that system's figured out, and the Rams exposed it in the 85 divisional playoff game. There was a moment when Jerry Gray had an interception that you could just see the look on Tom Landry's face as Danny White was coming to the sidelines, and the expression was, I don't know how we're going to win this game. And that face would come up frequently through the 86 and 87 and 88 season for Tom Landry until they finally just said, we got to go a different direction. So Dallas is out of the playoffs in resounding fashion, 20-0, and their dynasty's over. The Bears will go to the championship game with a 21-0 win over the Giants, the famous whiff game. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Sean Lindetta missed the kick. He whiffed it. He completely missed the ball on a punt, and the Bears recovered for a touchdown, and that was the beginning of the end of the New York Giants. Now, you listen to Bill Parcells, and he believes that the Giants could only beat the Bears if they played them 10 times. They could only beat them once. But he believed that day was one of those 10 times. I would garner to guess if that was one of the 10 times that you could beat the Chicago Bears. And the correct statement for that statement, Bill, should have been, you could have played the Bears 10 times and you wouldn't have beat them once, because you were resoundingly defeated in that game. And the Giants defense made it close, kept it close at halftime. I think it was only 14-0, 7-0 at halftime. But back in the 80s, guys, you knew when your team wasn't going to score. And the Giants were not going to score against the Chicago Bears. 7 points might as well have been 73 points. Sorry, Redskin fans. Now in the AFC, wow, do things look different. The Patriots go to New York to play the Jets in the wild card game. They force 6 turnovers and beat the Jets 26-14. And everyone's surprised because a lot of people thought maybe the Jets are for real, but here come the Patriots, and they just not really spanked them, but dominated the turnover battle. So as we advance to the AFC divisional playoff games, Miami should handle business. They're playing Cleveland, bad 8-8 football team. Dolphins are going to win easily, and the Patriots play the Raiders. And the Raiders should handle New England because, after all, they played in New England earlier in the year, and the Raiders beat them 35-20, and it wasn't even that close. And this game's in the LA Coliseum. It's over. Except the Raiders would turn the ball over 5 times, and New England would capitalize and turn those into points, and they beat the Raiders 27-20 in LA. And people were like, holy crap, the Patriots' talent is really coming into fruition. Their defense is playing outstanding. But the Dolphins were in real trouble. The Cleveland Browns went up 21-3 on Miami. Okay? In the fourth quarter, before Miami came back to win it 24-21. And a lot of people that were paying attention, they kind of, Miami just didn't take them seriously, but a lot of people went, Miami has a hard time stopping the run. If New England runs the ball, they have a puncher's chance of winning this game, even though New England had not won in the Orange Bowl in something like 17 games. But nonetheless, your conference championship games were set. Now, as a Ram fan, I'm glad the Rams made it as far as they did, because there wasn't anybody in the NFC that was going to get past the NFC championship game playing the Chicago Bears. So at least I know that the Rams were one of the 4 best teams in that season. And I take pride in that. There's no shame in admitting when a team is just inferior to another football team, and the Rams were inferior. Offensive line didn't compete with the Bears' defensive line. The running game was our only advantage, and I would argue that it was a draw when you put the Rams' running attack against the Bears' linebackers. Wide receiver versus secondary, Bear advantage. Bears' offensive line versus Rams' defensive line, Bears advantage. Bears running back versus Rams linebackers, Bears advantage. Rams secondary against the Bears secondary, Bears advantage. I mean, there was special teams was a draw, but then again, not so, because they were in Chicago. So Bears win 24-0. Second straight shutout. They allowed no points in the NFC playoffs to go to the Super Bowl. Now the Patriots would run the ball and exposed something that every team will take advantage of from 86 through the 1989 season on the Miami Dolphins. Miami, much to everyone's surprise, will not make the playoffs again in the decade. And for that matter, neither will the Oakland Raiders or the LA Raiders. So there is going to be a changing of the guard in the AFC. And many people kind of had their hand on who it was going to be, and they were right. But again, it's because they looked at things differently than they do now. They don't look at the right now. They looked at the whole progression of things. Dolphins lose 31-14 to the New England Patriots. New England advances to the Super Bowl. I really believe in this game the Bears were aggravated. They were angry, and they beat the crap out of New England, 46-10, to win the Super Bowl, despite going down 3-0. Now, 86, I'm not going to spend as much time on these next 3 seasons or 4 seasons because I think the groundwork is pretty much laid, right? At this point, after the 86 season, it's going to be very clear who the Elite 5 in each conference are going to be, okay? In the NFC, it's the 49ers, it's the Giants, it's the Redskins, it's the Rams, and it's the Bears. Fun fact, 4 of these 5 teams will make the playoffs these 5 teams will make the playoffs in 86. 3 of these 5 teams will make the playoffs every year from 86, really from 85 until 89, with the exception of 87. So the Bears, everyone defending champions, everyone thinks the Bears are going to be as good as ever. The Giants are going to be as good as ever. They saw improvement, although no one saw the Giants playing as well as they would down the stretch. The AFC's up. And after 86, it becomes very clear what's happened to the Raiders, what's happened to the Dolphins. And it's after 86, people look back and go, oh, well, the top teams in the decade, clearly at that point, were Browns, Broncos, Patriots, Oilers. Those are kind of the 3 teams, and the Bills. The Bills are really building quickly. But it's not fair to put the Bills in that category because they make the playoffs in 80 and 88 and 89. But they're more of a 90s trend. But in the 80s, there's definitely the Oilers. There's definitely the the Browns, the Broncos. That's pretty much it in the AFC. You throw the Oilers in there, like I said. Anyway, for 86, the Giants go 14-2. They win the East in resounding fashion. They lose the first game of the season on Monday night to the Cowboys, and then they won't lose another game to an NFC opponent the rest of the year. They lose only to the Seahawks down the stretch in Seattle, but they're in. They're legit. And I would argue Seattle would be a 4th team because Seattle had quite a run in the 80s. 83, 84, 87, 88. They made it 4 times, but I can't in good conscience put them in the category of nobody was picking Seattle to win Super Bowls in the 80s, certainly after the 85 season. Now, the Giants win the East at 14-2. The ironic thing is in the NFC Central, the Bears will win at 14-2. Now, the Bears don't win home field advantage due to conference record. The Giants will only have one conference defeat. The Bears will have two. They lose to the Vikings 23-7 in Minnesota in an embarrassing game. And then they lose to the Rams in Chicago 20-17 on a Mike Lansford 50-yard field goal in a game that the Rams had no passing attack except for 2 plays, but their defense played outstanding. And I just wish the Rams defense played as well against Chicago in this game, in the championship game the year before. But there was clearly we want to prove to everyone that we're good. And make no mistake about it, guys, when the Rams beat the Bears in 86, people went, whoa, how good are the Rams? And when the Rams would turn around and finally start Jim Everett, and they realized this team has a quarterback, the Rams are going to become the darlings of the NFC for the next 4 seasons. As soon as Everett can figure it out, the Rams are going to be dangerous. And they weren't kidding. But the Bears win the Central at 14-2. The 49ers win the West at 10-5-1. Now, the Rams had an opportunity to win the division in 86. All they had to do was win their final 2 games of the regular season. Okay? Their final 2 regular season games, home against Miami, they lost 37-31. If you're a Ram fan, go watch that game. It breaks my heart. It's disturbing to watch. We had no business losing, but we did. And then we play the 49ers on Friday night, essentially for the NFC Western Division Championship, and the Niners beat us 24-14 as we stumbled into the postseason. But the Rams were in prime position. They were 10-4 going into those final 2 games of the regular season, and a lot of people thought the Rams were going to be 11-5, 12-4, which was the same record as the Washington Redskins, and really would have made it a different situation because Washington would have had to come to LA in the NFC wildcard game. Although the Rams would have been the wildcard team, the Rams would have had to go to Chicago and play the Bears, but it didn't happen. And actually, that's not. Yeah, that would have been true. I'm sorry. The reason that would have been true, there was a funny little rule in the playoffs. Until 1990, the way the wild card worked was you could not play your division, a team in your division, in the divisional playoff game. So you had 3 division winners, and they all got first round buys, and then you had 2 wild card teams. So if the East and West, like in this situation, were playing, then the Rams, who was that 3rd floating seed, they would go to whatever division. So if the Redskins beat the 49ers, the Rams would go to Chicago, right? Or I'm sorry, the Rams would go to New York, and the Redskins would go to Chicago. If the 49ers won, it wouldn't have mattered. The Rams would have played the Bears, and the Giants would have played the 49ers. But it kind of works that way. So it doesn't matter because the Rams lose those 2 games, and the 49ers win the division at 10-5-1. And the 49ers are that floating team. So Chicago's either going to play San Francisco. I'm sorry. That was already set. They were either going to play, the Giants were either going to play San Francisco or LA. The Bears were either going to play San Francisco or Washington, depending on what happened in the NFC wildcard game. Now, sorry for the convoluted story. In the NFC, so the Rams win the wild card, in case you were wondering. And the Redskins are the other wild card team at 12-4. The Redskins start off 6-0. And you take 2 losses against the Giants away, and they're 14-2. You split with the Giants that year. They're both 13-3. Think about that. That's how dominant of a conference that division was. The Cowboys were 6-4. They were 7-4 before they lost 7-3 before they lost 6 straight. And ended up being eliminated for the playoffs at 7-9. And take solace in knowing this, Ram fans, that the Rams were the final nail in that Cowboy coffin. Again, in 86, we beat them in a Sunday night game. Let me look. It was Sunday night. I know the score. It was Sunday night. The Rams beat them 29-10, and that made Dallas at that point 7-7 with 2 games left to play. They were eliminated for the playoffs because there was nobody that was going to make it with 7 losses that year. especially with the 49ers winning like they were winning at the end of the year. The AFC was really surprising. The Browns went 12-4. They got it all together. They took the gloves, the kid gloves off of Bernie Kosar, and they let him go. And the Browns exploded because of it. Defensively, they played great that year. It was probably the best defensive year of the decade. And Denver, who everyone picked to go to the Super Bowl, got off to this great 6-0 start. They lose to the Jets. They end up going 8-2, and they end up going 8-1, and everyone's like, Denver. But then the friggin' roof fell in. They only won 3 games down the stretch to go 11-5, which really surprised people because Denver wasn't supposed to be that. But the Browns, they were just steady Eddie. They started off 5-3, and then they ended up 12-4. So they would only lose 1 game down the stretch, and the Browns would get home field advantage, and rightfully so. Now, the winner of the AFC West we talked about was Denver, but the winner of the AFC East was the New England Patriots. At 11-5, the Patriots won the division. Now, this surprised everyone, guys, and here's why. The New York Jets in 1986 were 10-1. By week 11, okay, you had the Giants at 9-2, and you had the Jets at 10-1. Everybody thought that was the Super Bowl. If it wasn't, it was going to be the Jets at New England, the Jets at Denver, or Denver at the Jets for the AFC Championship game. But the winner was going to play the Giants because a lot of people were really high on the Giants, although the Bears were still there. But you had 10-1, the 10-1 Patriots. I'm sorry, the 10-1 Jets, the 9-2 Giants, the 9-2 Chicago Bears at that point. Yeah, the 9-2 Chicago Bears, and you had the Broncos at 8-3. So these 4 teams pretty much solidified who was going to be in the championship game. But the Jets wouldn't win another game. They lost 5 in a row to end the season 10-6, and they got into the playoffs because the Patriots beat Miami in the Orange Bowl for the first time ever in regular season play, and the second time in a row they were there. Fun fact. And New England would then win the division, eliminate the Bengals, and get the Jets in the playoffs. As a wild card team, the Chiefs would be the other wild card team, and they wouldn't mess that up. The Jets wouldn't mess that up. At home against the Chiefs, they blew the doors open, beat them 35-15, and went on to the AFC divisional playoff game. The Redskins would beat the Rams. The Rams turned the ball over 6 times in RFK and ended up losing 19-7 as the Redskins would go on to the NFC divisional playoff game. Now, the Jets would go up by 10 with 5-7 minutes to go in the game against the Browns. They end up blowing it. The Browns force overtime. In the second overtime, the Browns win the game 23-20 to advance to the AFC Championship game. People were impressed with the Jets, but were kind of expecting the Browns to win, and then people were starting to wonder, how good are the Jets? But obviously the Jets ended up losing. And that would be the peak of the New York Jets 1980 season. They wouldn't get higher than that at that point, the 1980 decade. Meanwhile, the Redskins go to Chicago. The Giants play the 49ers. And guys, you're not mishearing this. The Giants beat the 49ers in New York. So now it's the second time they've played the 49ers in consecutive years. It's the third time, actually, they played them in consecutive years. And it's the fourth time they've played them so far. Sorry, I said fifth. It's the 4th time they would have played them in the decade. 2 in Candlestick, went to the Niners. 2 in New York, go to the Giants. The Giants could only score 10 points in the 2 games in Candlestick. The Giants could only score 3 points in the 2 games in New York. 17-3 in the wild card game in 85. And then get a load of this one. The Giants beat the 49ers 49-3 in the divisional playoff game. There was no question. People said, it's Giants in the Super Bowl at this point. You beat the 49ers that badly, how are you going to win? The Redskins go into Chicago and pull off the greatest upset of the decade. No question it's the greatest upset because they do it with Jay Schrader and George Rogers at running back. Granted, the Bears had Doug Flutie, but the Bears still had their defense and they still had Walter Payton. And for the Bears to lose that game in the fashion in which they lost it was surprising. But the Redskins prevailed. They came out, they went into Chicago, and they beat them 27-13 in rather handed fashion. So the championship game is the Giants and the Redskins, the Broncos and the Bears, or the Browns. Now the Browns, as we all know, go up 20-13 with 5.5 minutes to go, and the Broncos have the ball at their own 2-yard line. The drive, right? They go up the field, they tie the game. Browns get the ball in overtime, they do nothing with it. Denver kicks a field goal, they win it 23-20. The Giants shut out the Washington Redskins. So now the Giants are in the Super Bowl. The Bears last year gave up no points in the postseason. In the NFC playoffs, the Giants gave up 3. It tells you how great those two defenses were in consecutive years. But the Super Bowl is a different story. The Giants are down 10-9 at halftime and would end up winning 39-20. So Denver scores 20 points while the Patriots only scored 10. But the Giants handily win. They're Super Bowl champions, and everyone acknowledges that the Giants are here to stay. Now the Vikings would make themselves relevant in 87. I'm going to go through this pretty quick. The Redskins, everyone kind of goes, hey, if Washington puts it together, they could have a really good year. Joe Gibbs, the Redskins, no one's forgotten about Washington. And they shouldn't have. The Redskins ended up going 11-4 that year, I believe. Let me double check. Yep, they ended up going 11-4 in 87. The 49ers go 13-2. And everyone's like, the 49ers are the best team in the NFC, and they were. I still, I said that the Bears-Redskin game was the biggest upset to the decade to that point. It gets overtaken by another game. The Saints go 12-3 in 87. First time ever the Saints make the playoffs. So the West is competitive. 12-2 or 13-2 and 12-3 make the playoffs. They played 15 games because they lost one game due to the strike, and then the replacements played 3 games to salvage the season, so they played 15 games instead of 16. Now, again, I'm not going to get into the basics of the Rams. Just know that there was a big trade the Rams made that year, Halloween. They traded Eric Dickerson to the Colts. And Indianapolis will benefit from it. They win the division and become AFC East champions in Eric Dickerson's first year in Indy. And it's the Colts' first ever division championship as the Indianapolis Colts. The Cleveland Browns will be second in the race with a 10-5 record, and the Broncos, I believe, are also. Broncos go 11-4. The Browns go 10-5, and Denver gets the home field advantage. The other wild card team that year was Seattle. Doesn't get enough credit for the season that they put together in 87, but they played really well. Got it together after going 10-6 the year before to make the playoffs. The Houston Oilers will be the other wild card team because Seattle won the East. I'm sorry, Seattle was the other wild card team. The winner of the West was Denver, and then the Oilers would be the other wild card team. But due to a better record, the Oilers would be home. In the NFC, we talked about the Redskins, the 49ers, and the Saints. But the Bears would win the Central again, and I believe they were 11-4 that year. And the Vikings would make it at 8-7. There was a few teams that missed it at 8-7. In particular, in the AFC, the Patriots missed it at 8-7. The Chargers missed it at 8-7. The Steelers missed it at 8-7. The Cowboys and Cardinals both missed it at 8-7. But the Vikings make it. And the Vikings have the most difficult road. They have to go to 12-3. New Orleans. And they go into New Orleans and they beat them 44-10. Anthony Carter had himself a day, as Eric likes to say, and would advance to go to the divisional playoff game. Now, I don't consider this as big of an upset as the Redskins Vikings as the Redskins Bears, because the Saints had never been to the playoffs before, and there was that element. Plus, it was in a dome, which was something the Vikings were comfortable playing in. So even though, we like to talk about the noise in New Orleans today, and trust me, I don't think it's ever been louder than it was that day in New Orleans, at least for the first quarter. But once the Vikings blew the doors off, that stadium was eerily silent. I don't consider that as big of an upset, even though they blew them out, just because of the fact that the Saints had never, ever, ever, ever been there before. The next round, the Oilers would beat the Seahawks in overtime to go to the wild card game. or the divisional playoff round, and they would play Denver, while Indy would play at Cleveland. Now, the Browns would handle business 38-21 over the Colts to go on to the 38-21 over the Colts to go to the AFC Championship game for the second year in a row. The Broncos would absolutely destroy the Oilers 34-10 to go to make sure that they're hosting the AFC Championship game in Denver. The Redskins have to go to Chicago, right? Because the Bears can't play the Vikings due to the new rule. So for the second year in a row, Washington goes to Chicago. And in Walter Payton's farewell game, they beat him 21-17. And Jim McMahon was the starting quarterback that year. But the Bears had a better record. They were 11-4 like the Redskins, but they had a better conference record, which is why they were home for that game. And the Redskins had to do it the hard way. They had to go on the road and beat a very good Bears team that everyone was still high on for the Super Bowl 2 years earlier. But after the 85 season, or the 86, after the 87 season, some people wondered if that luster had come off the Bears. Not many, but a few. The 49ers, however, they get shocked. They get beat 36-24 at home by the Minnesota Vikings. And that was actually the early game. So the Bears and Redskins were playing for the right to be home for the NFC Championship game. Going into that game, going into the weekend, it was assumed one of those two were going to go on the road and play the 49ers in San Fran. But when the Vikings beat the 49ers in the greatest upset of the decade, without question, everyone was like, holy crap. So the Redskins play the Vikings, but the Vikings' magic doesn't end. They play a tough game. The Redskins narrowly win 17-10, and they advance to the Super Bowl for the third time in the decade. And the 49ers, who many people thought were going to advance to the third Super Bowl in the decade, fell short when they lost to the Vikings. The Browns and Broncos in a rematch. A lot of people thought this game was going to be good until halftime. Halftime, Denver was blowing out the Browns, and everyone's like, oh, it's it. Browns are done. Browns came roaring back. And with an opportunity to take the lead, 38-31, to tie the game at 31, Ernest Biner going into the end zone, the notorious fumble, right? He gets stripped. Denver recovers, take a safety, and they end up winning the game. Let me start over. They're up 38-31. That touchdown would have tied it. He fumbles, they get the ball, Denver holds onto it. They end up taking a safety to win it 38-33, and they go on to the Super Bowl. Now, in the Super Bowl, between the Broncos and the Redskins, a lot of people don't realize this, but Denver had a 10-0 lead. And up until the Patriots Super Bowl, there might have been a Super Bowl before that where there was a larger comeback, but that's the one I think of. The largest comeback in Super Bowl history was the Redskins in 87, coming back from 10 down to beat the Broncos. Now, their comeback happened in the second quarter. 5 second-quarter touchdowns, put up 35 points in that quarter to end up going on and winning it 42-10. Now I'm going to wrap these two up because I don't want this to go too much longer. So let me get through 88 here pretty quick. 88, the 49ers go 10-6. They struggled through most of the season, lots of injuries. Young kind of starts to make an appearance. But the 49ers make it, and they win the division at 10-6. The Bengals win their division at 12-4. They get off to their best start in franchise history, 6-0. Things are looking great. Boomer's the NFL MVP. Cincinnati guys, I'm telling you, in 88, they were every bit as good as people talk about. They were a lethal football team in 88. Bears don't go nowhere. The Bears end up going 13-3. I believe 12-4. They go 12-4 and win their division again. And to make matters even better for Chicago, they have home field advantage throughout the playoffs. They're the best team in the NFC that year, 12-4. The Bills also go 12-4, but because of their loss to Cincinnati earlier in the year, week 11, or 10 or 12, one of those, the Bengals ended up getting home field advantage. Now, Buffalo could have gotten home field advantage in the last week of the season, but they lost to the Colts inexplicably, and that gave Cincinnati the division, or the home field advantage. Minnesota plays strong. They play hard. They're 10-6. They make the playoffs again. Might have even been 11-5, actually. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, they're 11-5, might be. They were 11-5 in 85, in 88. And they end up hosting the Rams, who go 10-6 in the wild card game. Now, that 86 team was pretty amazing, 88 team. The Rams in 88, they were 7-6 going into the final week of the season. They had to play Chicago at home, they had to play Atlanta, and then they had the 49ers in Candlestick. Okay? And they won all three of those games in impressive fashion. 23-3, 22-7, and 38-16. So a lot of people thought the Rams, Jim Everett's figured it out. They put it all together. They had that year to learn. The Rams are going to be deadly. And they would have been. 2 turnovers in the first quarter cost the Rams. They never recovered. They lose to the Vikings 28-16 in the wild card game. The Eagles would win the East. And because of that, and because the Vikings won, Philly would have to go to Chicago, and the Vikings would go to San Francisco in a rematch of the 87 game. In the AFC, the Seahawks win the West at 9-7. The Oilers, they win the wild card, as do the Cleveland Browns. Oilers won the wild card the week 15 against the Bengals, but the Browns would get the wild card with their week 16 win over Houston, and then have to play Houston again in the wild card game. Houston beats the Browns this time after losing to them in Cleveland the week before. They beat Cleveland in Cleveland this time and advance to the AFC divisional playoff game to play Buffalo, which means Cincinnati has to play Seattle. Now, as that breaks down, Buffalo beats the Oilers 17-10. They get their first home playoff win in years. The Eagles play the Bears in what's known as the Fog Bowl. Once that fog kicked in, the Eagles never had a chance, and the Eagles lose to the Bears 20-12. And the Bears would end up playing the 49ers at home. And the Bills would have to go to Cincinnati. Everyone had this game built up, and there's a lot of stuff that I'm going to talk about going into the 80s. The Bills stealing the no-huddle offense by first trying to ban it. That's a true story. The Bengals were banned from using their hurry-up offense. They beat the Bills anyway, 21-10, and went to the Super Bowl. And a lot of people thought they were going to win it. A lot of people thought they were going to win it. The 49ers went into Chicago and opened up a can of whoop butt on the Bears, beat them 28-3. So people knew the Niners were good, but you got to keep in mind, at this time, people aren't locked into one player. They're looking at whole teams, and the Dolphins, or the Bengals, had a better team. But as the Super Bowl would unfold, it's 16-13 Cincinnati with 5.5 minutes to go, and the 49ers drive up the field, and with 58 seconds left on the clock, finds John Taylor for the game-winning touchdown, and they win it 20-16 in what, in my opinion, is, to this day, one of the top 3 all-time Super Bowls ever. Great game. Now, the final year of the decade, 89. I'm going to try to make this quick and get this in under 10 minutes. There's not a lot to talk about. The top 2 teams in the NFC that year in the NFL in 1989 was the San Francisco 49ers and the Los Angeles Rams. There was nobody better than those 2 teams. Now, if people want to claim the Giants, you can claim the Giants, but the 49ers blew them out on Monday night, and the Rams blew them out 31-10 in LA. The Rams and 49ers, they were the 2 best teams, bar none, in the NFL in 89. The Rams would beat them in Candlestick 13-12, and the Niners would beat them 30-27 in LA after coming back from 2 17-point deficits to win the game at the very end. The 49ers at 14-2 win the NFC West. The Giants at 12-4 win the NFC East. The Eagles at 11-5 win the wild card. The Rams at 11-5 win the wild card. And the Vikings at 9-6-1, they win the AFC or the NFC Central because the Bears had a really bad year. They fell apart at the end of the year with injuries and a bunch of other things. The Bills go 9-7, and the Browns, I believe, were also 10-6-1. Let me double check. Yeah, they were 9-6-1 in 1989. But it was good enough they won the division, so they were home. The other team was the Houston Oilers. They ended up going 9-7 that year. But the Broncos at 11-5 won their division. So Denver and Cleveland, 11-5, 9-6-1, they host. The Steelers at 9-7, the Oilers at 9-7, and the Bills at 9-7 all make the playoffs. Now, Buffalo won the East, So they're already playing Cleveland because both Houston and Pittsburgh are playing each other in the wild card game. So either Houston or Pittsburgh's going to Denver because of the rule. Pittsburgh pulls out an incredible overtime victory, 26-23. They lost to the Oilers more than the previous two games. They lost to them several times consecutively in a row. But they were swept by Houston that year and still went into Houston and beat the Oilers. Pittsburgh would go to Denver, and people were thinking shades of 84, as Pittsburgh made the playoffs for the first time since then. The Rams would go to Philadelphia, and in a game that really showed how overmatched the Eagles were, the Rams dominated the game 21-7. They were up 14-0. Philly got a touchdown to make it 14-7, and the Rams finished them off 21-7 to go to New York, while the Vikings would have to now play the San Francisco 49ers in a rematch for the third time in a row. So 87, 88, and 89, the 49ers and Vikings are going to play each other in the divisional playoff game. Now, the Browns maybe should have lost to the Buffalo Bills. Jim Kelly throws an interception at the end of the game at the goal line. Clay Matthews Sr. intercepts it and preserves the victory and puts the Cleveland Browns in the AFC Championship game for the third time in 4 years, as they barely and narrowly beat the Buffalo Bills 34-30. The Broncos struggle mightily with the Pittsburgh Steelers 24-21. And some people are like, well, now Denver may be vulnerable against the run like Miami was in 85. But that wasn't the case. This really was a case of Denver overlooking Pittsburgh, and I'll tell you why. They had played earlier in the year, and they beat them 34-7 in Denver. So there was an element of we're not really surprised, but they were. And Hodge fumbles at the end of the game when the Steelers are in field goal range and would have tied the game, but as it turned out, Denver wins it 24-21. The 49ers absolutely spanked for the second year in a row the Minnesota Vikings. The year before, I didn't give you the score. The year before, they beat the Vikings in their revenge game, 34-9. This time, they beat them 41-13. The Rams beat the Giants in overtime, 19-13, on a Flipper Anderson touchdown pass at the end of the game. Truly a great game. The Rams, it was the third time in a row the Rams had beaten the Giants, and the second time in 3 years in New York. The interesting thing to keep in mind here, the second time in 3 games, I should say, in New York. The interesting thing to keep in mind here is that the Rams were on the road on the East Coast for the third straight week. That had never been done before. The Rams had to go to New England in to end the regular season. They had a win to get in. They beat New England in New England. Then they had to go to Philly. Then they had to go to New York, and they didn't stay over, back east. They traveled back home and back to the east, back home and back to the east before they got to the championship game. And I think a lot of that fatigue had a lot to do with it. Also, I think this 49er team might have been the best 49er team of the decade, and it might have been the second best team in the entire decade. Better than the 86 Giants, better than the 84 49ers, better than any team outside of the 85 Bears. They played the Rams at home. They go down 3-0, and they blow them out 30-3. Denver handles business against the Cleveland Browns. They go up big on the Browns. The Browns come back to make it a 3-point game, 24-21, after going down 21-3. I'm sorry, 20. They went down 21-0, then 24-7, and then they made it 24-21, but then the Broncos ended up beating them 37-24, or 37-21, sorry, and it wasn't even close. And then, of course, the Super Bowl, the 49ers absolutely obliterated the Denver Broncos 55-10 in the Super Bowl. The greatest blowout in Super Bowl history to this day belongs to the Niners. And that's the 80s. So really, as the decade unfolded, people started realizing Broncos, Browns, Oilers as a consistent threat in the AFC. But in the NFC, you had the Redskins, you had the Bears, you had the Rams, you had the 49ers. You could throw the Vikings in at the end of the decade, although I tend not to. But they did make it 5 times in the decade, so feel free to put them in that equation. Somebody was making the playoffs. One of those, 3 of those 5 teams every year except for one. and that was 1987. Once it was established, of course. That wasn't the case in the early part of the decade because you saw that transition take place. And the Giants really started to make themselves known, and they would be a threat for the first part of the 90s, but they kind of fade away once Bill Parcells retired. So we'll see what happens in this upcoming decade, but I hope you guys enjoyed installment 2. That wraps up the decade. I'm going to spend some time talking specifically about the Rams in the third segment and just the Rams' progression through the decade from the 70s and through the 80s and what the 90s were supposed to be. And then I'll kind of end it with what the 90s turned out to be for the Rams, which was utter disappointment. And then, like I said, I'm going to cover 2 other segments on the 80s. One is going to cover the players of the 80s, and the other one's going to cover the best games of the 80s. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Sorry about the long video. Subscribe, like, all that good stuff. See you guys next time.